The topic of today's video is William Wilson, which was published in late 1839, the same year as The Fall of the House of Usher, and it gives us another one of Poe's unreliable problem narrators. But unlike Usher, with its subtleties and ambiguities, it doesn't take long for most readers to see what Poe's up to this time. We recognize the narrator is battling his conscience, which his degenerate imagination externalizes in the form of a spectral double that pursues him wherever he goes. While the plot of Usher moves slowly and somewhat unpredictably, William Wilson is packed with a variety of incidents spread out over a period of several years and in several different locations. Events for a Poe story follow quickly one after another, and a pattern emerges that allows us to anticipate what will happen next. Of all the stories we've read so far, this one is the most didactic, the most explicitly moral. Starting with the fact that William Wilson shares a birthday with Poe, many commentators have observed significant parallels between elements of the story and Poe's own life, including his recurrent struggles with alcohol, for example. The narrator attends 3 schools: Dr. Bransby's boarding school for 5 years, Eton College for 3 years, and the University of Oxford for another 2, while as a child, Poe attended boarding school in England, later enrolled at the University of Virginia, where he took up drinking and gambling, and eventually made his way to West Point, from which he was expelled in 1831 for repeated conduct violations. By the time he wrote William Wilson, Poe was already making a name for himself in the American literary scene, but it's unlikely he would have expected or encouraged readers outside his intimate circle of family and friends to make these connections. And it seems just as unlikely that he intended the tale as a kind of oblique self-portrait or concealed autobiography. He may have drawn on some of his own negative life experiences, which is certainly worthy of notice, but one must be careful not to overstate these connections or ascribe personal meanings where none was intended. William Wilson originally appeared in The Gift in 1839. The Gift was a literary annual edited by Eliza Leslie. Several more of Poe's stories would appear in later volumes. The Pit and the Pendulum appeared in 1842, and The Purloined Letter in 1844. So we'll talk about some of the themes and motifs of the story, and I have narrowed it down to 3. We'll start with Byronism, and we'll talk about the vitiated imagination, and then, of course, we have to talk about the doppelganger, the double, as a theme. So starting with Byronism then, early on in his writing career, while he was still trying to make a name for himself as a poet, Poe was heavily influenced by the English poet Lord Byron, who died in 1824 when Poe was 15 years old. Byron was enormously popular across Europe and in America, the first major poet to cultivate a kind of rebellious rock and roll persona. One of his lovers memorably described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. The heroes of Byron's narrative poems were all of the same general stamp, with similar traits. They're often social outcasts, misunderstood by most ordinary people, and persecuted for unconventional lifestyle choices, and sometimes for greater crimes. They are exhausted by the burden of their guilt and personal grievances. They prefer to be alone and exhibit a morbid sensibility. That is, they're obsessed with death, decay, ruins, and dark supernatural forces. This attitude is prevalent in Poe's early poetry, some of which we will read later, but the narrator of William Wilson certainly fits this profile. Here's how he introduces himself using the second person in the first paragraph of the story. "O outcast of all outcasts, most abandoned, to the earth art thou not forever dead, to its honors, to its flowers, to its golden aspirations? And a cloud, dense, dismal, and limitless, does it not hang eternally between thy hopes and heaven?" The narrator then adopts a confessional tone, similar in some respects to Montresor in The Cask of Amontillado, only here the confession is more explicit, thrusting upon the reader a moral obligation that Montresor never does. "Death approaches," he says, and the shadow which foreruns him has thrown a softening influence over my spirit. I long, in passing through the dim valley, for the sympathy, I nearly said for the pity, of my fellow men. I would fain have them believe that I have been, in some measure, the slave of circumstances beyond human control. I would wish them to seek out for me, in the details I am about to give, some little oasis of fatality amid a wilderness of error. I would have them allow what they cannot refrain from allowing, that, although temptation may have erewhile existed as great, man was never thus, at least, tempted before, certainly never thus fell. Above all else, what he encourages us to believe is that to some degree, in some measure, his crimes were inevitable, that he was destined or predisposed to vice, and he casts much of the blame on what he describes as a pathological imagination inherited from his parents. So the vitiated imagination, this is a motif that recurs throughout the story. I am the descendant, he tells us, of a race whose imaginative and easily excitable temperament has at all times rendered them remarkable. And in my earliest infancy, I gave evidence of having fully inherited the family character. As an illustration, he draws on memories from his time at Bransby's boarding school, recalling mundane events that are forgotten by most men by the time they reach adulthood, but that remain vivid to his mind. The morning's awakening, he tells us, the nightly summons to bed, the connings, the recitations, the periodical half-holidays and perambulations, the playground with its broils, its pastimes, its intrigues, these, by a mental sorcery long forgotten, were made to involve a wilderness of sensation, a world of rich incident, a universe of varied emotion, of excitement the most passionate and spirit-stirring. Had his mind been exposed to more positive influences, nurtured on salubrious scenes of natural beauty, perhaps his imagination could have aided in the development of a firmer moral sense. But like Roderick Usher, his mind is stimulated from an early age by obscurity, disorientation, and dislocation, epitomized in the architecture of the school itself. I'm going to read a long passage from page 219. How quaint an old building was this! To me, how veritably a palace of enchantment. There was really no end to its windings, to its incomprehensible subdivisions. It was difficult, at any given time, to say with certainty upon which of its 2 stories one happened to be. From each room to every other there were sure to be found 3 or 4 steps, either in ascent or descent. Then the lateral branches were innumerable, inconceivable, and so returning in upon themselves, that our most exact ideas in regard to the whole mansion were not very far different from those with which we pondered upon infinity. During the 5 years of my residence here, I was never able to ascertain with precision in what remote locality lay the sleeping apartments assigned to myself and some 18 or 20 other scholars. He continues describing the school for a couple of paragraphs, and then we get to this interesting passage. Encompassed by the massy walls of this venerable academy, I passed, yet not in tedium or disgust, the years of the 3rd lustrum of my life. And this sentence, I'm going to stop here. This next sentence, seems very significant to me. The teeming brain of childhood requires no external world of incident to occupy or amuse it. That statement seems untrue to me and potentially harmful, but I'm going to continue. And the apparently dismal monotony of a school was replete with more intense excitement than my riper youth has derived from luxury or my full manhood from crime. Yet I must believe that my first mental development had in it much of the uncommon, even much of the outre. In the same way, then, that Roderick Usher's overstimulated and vitiated imagination conceives a morbid psychic connection between himself and his house, the carceral incoherence of Bransby's school, the architecture of the school, fosters a psychic split in William Wilson's mind, creating the external manifestation of his conscience. a conscience which seeks to regulate his impulsivity and selfish pursuit of pleasure, effectively creating, at least in his imaginative world, two William Wilsons. So we'll talk now about that, the doppelganger. We have seen Poe's predilection for doubles and twins already. In Loss of Breath, for example, we had Mr. Lack of Breath and Mr. Wind Enough. Then there's Pluto and his avenging double, feline double in The Black Cat. And of course, Roderick and his twin sister Madeline in The Fall of the House of Usher. That the second William Wilson is the narrator's displaced conscience becomes increasingly apparent as he sinks further and further into depravity. But it's evident from his first introduction at Bransby School, where the double adopts a reproachful, minatory attitude towards the narrator, which he of course resists, and yet he cannot deny feeling some connection to his adversary. I'm going to read a couple of passages here, both of them on page 221. In his rivalry, he might have been supposed actuated solely by a whimsical desire to thwart, astonish, or mortify myself. Although there were times when I could not help observing, with a feeling made up of wonder, abasement, and pique, that he mingled with his injuries, his insults, or his contradictions, a certain most inappropriate and assuredly most unwelcome affectionateness of manner. I could only conceive this singular behavior to arise from a consummate self-conceit, assuming the vulgar airs of patronage and protection. And here now is how the narrator feels towards his impostor. It is difficult indeed to define or even to describe my real feelings towards him. They formed a motley and heterogeneous admixture, some petulant animosity, which was not yet hatred, some esteem, more respect, much fear, with a world of uneasy curiosity. To the moralist, it will be unnecessary to say, in addition, that Wilson and myself were the most inseparable of companions. So he hates him and yet respects him. He esteems him and fears him at the same time. As the narrator's hatred of his doppelganger intensifies, so too does his awareness of their mutual inextricability, a connection that transcends mere physical resemblance, a growing sense he has of some psychic kinship between them. Here's another intriguing passage. I discovered, or fancied I discovered, in his accent, his air, and general appearance, a something which first startled and then deeply interested me by bringing to mind dim visions of my earliest infancy, wild, confused, and thronging memories of a time when memory herself was yet unborn. I cannot better describe the sensation which oppressed me than by saying that I could with difficulty shake off the belief of my having been acquainted with the being who stood before me at some epoch very long ago, some point of the past even infinitely remote. This vague recognition builds and finally culminates in a scene of dramatic recognition, where the narrator finally sees himself physically replicated in the other William Wilson. Poe manages this scene in a clever way so that we know what the narrator sees, even though he refuses to acknowledge it himself. I lowered the lamp in still nearer proximity to the face. Were these the lineaments of William Wilson? I saw indeed that they were his, but I shook as if with a fit of the ague in fancying they were not. What was there about them to confound me in this manner? I gazed, while my brain reeled with a multitude of incoherent thoughts. Not thus he appeared, assuredly not thus, in the vivacity of his waking hours. The same name, the same contour of person, the same day of arrival at the academy, and then his dogged and meaningless imitation of my gait, my voice, my habits, and my manner. Was it in truth within the bounds of human possibility that what I now saw was the result merely of the habitual practice of this sarcastic imitation? I'm going to stop here. At this point, the narrator flees Bransby's school and commences his grand tour of corruption and dissipation, first at Eton College and then later the University of Oxford, before heading off to Europe, where he ultimately has one last violent confrontation with his double, William Wilson. We'll discuss these scenes in greater detail in class.